Over the last few days, both Sony and Microsoft have stepped out and confirmed a bunch more information about their upcoming consoles, the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X. This now means, as potential buyers of these consoles, that we've got a better idea of what each of them is going to offer us and which might be more suited to our current gaming setup. So in this video, we're going to go and break down everything from the spec list, the power of these consoles, potential games, backwards compatibility, and even more features, so you know exactly where things stand right now. Right then, let's start with the specification lists and power output, because that seems to be what everyone is discussing online at the moment. When you put the two consoles side by side, it does seem at this very early stage that Microsoft comes out on top with the Xbox Series X. Microsoft did have a 2-day head start over Sony when they released their information. They did it via a bunch of articles and different tweets, and that gave players the details that Microsoft thought was most important. And then Sony, on the other hand, they opted to do this really in-depth live stream of the console and how all of the parts come together to create something that they think gamers will want. So stripping away all the fluff and boiling it down to the core elements, it does appear that Microsoft, at least at this stage, has a power advantage with the Xbox Series X, but it doesn't appear to be quite as clear-cut as people were first suggesting. In terms of CPU, both consoles are going with AMD Zen 2 units, 8-core, 16 threads, with the Xbox Series X being clocked at 3.8 GHz and the PlayStation 5 being clocked at 3.5 GHz. But things get a lot deeper than just those two numbers. The Series X is reserving one of those cores, so 2 of the threads, for the underlying operating system, which means that developers will have access to 7 cores and 14 threads for their games. If they opt for the 7-core route, the CPU will be clocked at 3.8 GHz in its most powerful position. But if they opt to utilize hyperthreading, and they want to split each core into 2, giving them 14 threads, the CPU clock speed will drop down to 3.6 GHz. Microsoft has said that these two states are completely locked in terms of their clock speed, and they won't change according to load or thermal conditions. And then as for Sony, with the PlayStation 5, it gets a little bit more complicated than that, as the CPU power and the output of it is tied into the GPU as well, which is the graphics processing unit. So for the GPU, and we'll start off with Sony and the PlayStation 5, it's using an AMD RDNA 2 unit running at 2.23 GHz, delivering 10.28 teraflops of peak performance via 36 compute units. But based on workload, it can drop lower than that frequency. Sony is using a boost system by setting power budgets tied to the thermal limits of the cooling hardware, which means instead of power draw increasing and decreasing, it's going to allow frequencies of the CPU and the GPU to change based on the workload. And then, on top of that, the PlayStation 5 will use AMD's Smart Shift technology to send unused power from the CPU over to the GPU to crank out some more pixels for you. So yeah, that was a bit of a long-winded explanation, but I know it's important to explain it because it's very, very different from the approach that Microsoft is going for with the Xbox Series X. The Series X GPU is the same AMD RDNA 2 unit, but this time it's running at 1.8 GHz, delivering 12 teraflops of peak performance via 52 compute units. So it's running slower than the PlayStation 5, but it has more compute units and it ends up outputting more performance, making it on paper more powerful. The 1.8 GHz figure is locked as well. There's no boosting or dropping down with the Series X like there is with the PlayStation 5. And the main reason for that, according to Microsoft, is because 12 teraflops of performance was always their end goal, to push past the performance of previous generations of consoles so they could achieve their goals of consistent 4K 60 FPS and 120 FPS high refresh rate output. So, two very different approaches, but it seems that Microsoft takes the win in terms of raw power. Both of the consoles feature 16GB of RAM, and that puts them on par with most mid-range gaming PCs in 2020. 16GB is more than enough to run most games, but these days the demands for RAM for PC games is climbing up, and many games are now recommending 32GB to eliminate any bottlenecks, but most of the time their minimum spec is 16 or sometimes 8GB. But with the Series X and the PS5, every unit having the same hardware inside, that does leave developers an easier task of optimizing their games because they only have one build of hardware specification to go on, whereas the PC, they have to account for thousands of different hardware combinations. So 16GB for the consoles should be absolutely fine. Next, we come over to the storage solutions, and again, they're kind of using different approaches, but similar approaches. And I'm not sure here if one comes out on top or not. For the longest time now, both the Xbox One and the PS4, the older generation consoles, they've really suffered from the bottleneck of using old, slow mechanical hard drives, and that massively restricts the speed of the consoles. In the Xbox Series X and the PlayStation 5, Microsoft and Sony have both elected to move onto SSDs. But each console has their own implementation that we do need to discuss. And all of this work is in aid of speeding up loading times and making each of the consoles just feel more snappy in their performance. Microsoft, in the Series X, is opting for a custom, all-metal construction 1TB NVMe SSD. The all-metal construction, that acts as a heatsink to prevent the SSD from fading in performance the hotter it gets. That's something that Microsoft didn't want happening, with the rest of their console being all about providing consistent performance. Now, Microsoft has also developed an external storage solution as well. If you need more than the 1TB of internal storage, they've partnered with Seagate to create what looks like a memory card, so it's a bit of a throwback to the previous console generations. This external SSD will perform identically to the internal one by using a PCI Express 4.0 connection to link that storage directly to the processor. Now, as for Sony, their live stream did go on a bit about how their implementation of an SSD was going to be amazing, and I have no doubt that it will be very, very fast, but the info was extremely heavy, and most of it was fluff around the edges, so let me just get you straight to the point. The PlayStation 5 will be using an 825GB custom chip connected to the CPU via PCI Express 4.0. Now, the reason for 825GB instead of 1TB is because, according to Sony, that's the most optimal match for the proprietary interface that Sony has designed. The system has 6 priority levels as well, and that goes above the usual NVMe standard of just 2 priority levels, and that means that devs can have full control over the delivery of data according to the game's specific needs. Now, when it comes to external or additional storage, Sony hasn't built anything like Microsoft's memory card. Instead, they're just going to allow players to connect external storage, and that means that it won't be anywhere near as fast as the internal SSD, but perhaps that's okay for some of the games that you don't really play very much. The PS5 will also have an NVMe slot that you can put another drive into, but with it not being part of Sony's proprietary storage system, it will have bottlenecks. So basically, Sony has created something so complex inside their PS5 that it's now out ahead of conventional storage solutions. So internal storage in the PS5 should be wickedly fast, but if you need more, that could become a problem. And just to add on to the end here, the Xbox Series X with that external memory card, I think you can also use external hard drives or existing ones you've already gotten by connecting them up with a USB port. It's just that that will also be much slower than the internal storage. And now, the biggest part, price and release dates. No side is really giving anything concrete away, but Microsoft have announced that the Series X is due to launch in holiday 2020, with Sony confirming a 2020 release. Neither company has announced pricing either, but analysts are predicting a price around the $500 mark for both of these systems, which, when you look at the hardware each console contains, that is very competitive. So then, right now, it is kind of hard to say which of these two consoles is going to dominate the next-gen war. The Xbox Series X wins some rounds and the PS5 wins some others, but all of this is on paper at the moment, and really we're just going to have to wait and see till the end of the year how things pan out. For me, the decision to buy which console will probably come down to the games that it supports, but with the last couple of years of the console war bringing more features like crossplay and cross-save progression, it could be that this next generation of consoles is less about the games and more about which ecosystem you prefer being part of. But thanks very much for watching. Leave me a rating and a comment. It is always appreciated. And I'll catch you guys in the next one.